Mark, I'm just sending you the slide. Where's Mark? Who should I send the slides to? Andrew? Okay, I sent it to you, Andy. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So we're going to talk about 1 Samuel chapter 25 today. It's a bit of a longer chapter, but it's okay. Hopefully we'll get through it. Before we talk about today's chapter, does anyone remember what we spoke about last week, or where we're up to in the story of King David?
Even his own friends were saying, like people close to him, saying, "Oh, you could do this easily," but he chose not to. And not only did he not do it, he did cut a piece of Saul's robe. And then when he spoke to Saul, he showed utmost respect, even bowing to him, and just made it clear that, like, regardless of what people might say or whatever, he isn't a threat to Saul at all. And he just told him what was happening. He had a chance to do something, but he didn't. And obviously he asked Saul to just let him be. And obviously Saul did leave, but I think you mentioned that this isn't the last time we hear of this kind of thing happening. So it's something that he can't control.
That's right. So David, he's become quite famous amongst the people of Israel. So the Israelite people, in context, they're trying to create a nation for themselves. As they try and create a nation for themselves, they became under slavery in Egypt. They exodused. They left Egypt. They became a nation. They got lost in the desert for many, many years. They finally entered into the promised land. They fought with the locals in basically modern-day Israel. They fought with the locals. Eventually, they were successful against the majority, and they became a nation. And the first king, and then they rebelled against God and Samuel. Samuel is still alive at this point. They had a period of judges, Samuel being the last judge. They reject Samuel and say, well, look, we'd like a king like everyone else. We want to be like the rest of the nations. They get a king. That first king is Saul. Saul is wonderful to begin with. He's chosen by God. He has all the right characteristics, inner and outer characteristics. But he is rejected by God because he falls from grace. He commits a series of sins that makes God leave him. David, in the meantime, this young shepherd boy who's like kind of a nobody, is starting to grow in favor. As he grows in favor, the people love him. Saul gets jealous of him. Because of the love of the people, he can see that God has chosen him. He's been anointed already. But David himself is not targeting the king. He's not trying to become king or anything like that. But by Saul counterproductively, Saul pushing David away, being aggressive against David, is creating David's becoming a center of gravity for all the people that are rejected and away from the mainstream, and therefore he's getting more and more powerful. So Saul is chasing him to kill him. As he chases him around, David has the opportunity to kill him, which we saw last week. He doesn't take it. He shows how honorable he is. And then Saul, eats humble pie, disappears, says, "Oh, you're so much better than me," and leaves. As Albert said, he's going to come back, but not yet. So this chapter, Saul has left, and David is now in a new region as he's trying to figure out what to do with himself. Okay, so we'll start the chapter, and then there's a couple of maps on the screen after the first little bit, which will just kind of orient ourselves spatially as well. So we'll read the first verse in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So Samuel we haven't heard about for a while. Okay, Samuel is the last judge. After they reject, they say, we want another king. Samuel says, how you're rejecting God. God says they're rejecting me, not you. So don't be upset. Give them the king, but they're going to suffer for their king, which they do. And then Samuel is there to just transition into the kingship. So he anoints Saul, he anoints David. He's obviously very elderly. He kind of disappears from the scene. We don't see much of him. And then the first verse of chapter 25. Then Samuel died. That's it, finished. Then Samuel died. Great Samuel. And the Israelites gathered together and lamented for him and buried him at his home in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. That's it, see, just like that. All this big life of Samuel, and then Samuel died. There's a few, I think, lessons to think about from the life of Samuel. They reckon he's about 90 years old. It's a good chance to reflect on him. He started his service when he was a child. He went all the way to 90. His whole life is dedicated to God. There's no better way to exit this world than a life dedicated to God from beginning to end, a life that is God's from top to bottom. Whether or not there's a big scene created around Samuel's death is kind of irrelevant because he's honorable in front of God. But for us, I think it's important to understand that our life is fleeting, our life is sudden, the world is going to continue without us. There is so much more than our life going on that we don't worry too much about our life here on earth. And the legacy, some people, they live a life dreaming of the way people see them after they die, In that sense, that's a kind of useless legacy because you're dead. It's not going to do you any benefit after this point. All that's going to matter about your life is your actual life in front of God, your soul. The way that God perceives you, the legacy you leave in heaven. The legacy you leave here on earth is just irrelevant. So, because you know what's going to happen? Every single one of us, the second you die, then Father Paul died. Just done, finished. Thanks for coming. That's it. And then what's going to happen is my eternity, my soul. Whatever I did here on earth that built me mansions in heaven, not what happened here on earth. So it's very important for us to think that way, to understand. So even a big character like Samuel, it's just then he died. So just keep that in our minds as we think about how important our life is. We get so caught up in the self-importance of our own lives. Even Samuel, life goes on. Life goes on. So just keep that in your minds as you consider your lives. Our life is but a vapor. Just remember that. Our life is just a vapor, but our souls are forever. And so you got to put a lot of more effort into your soul than your physical life here on earth. Really, really important. We know that Samuel put a lot of effort into his soul because he dedicated his whole life to God from childhood to 90 years old. So that's far more important to him than the way that they all weep and lament for him here on earth. That's why there's nothing given to it. Within that same verse, and David rose and went down to prayer. That's it. We're moving on. Also, it's important to understand that Samuel is preparing the way for Christ. And this whole journey of the Old Testament is just part of the story of salvation. And so his part in that story of salvation is complete, but the story must continue to Christ. That's the critical element of the whole biblical picture. So I just thought to bring attention to that. Okay. Now, so David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. And the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. So before we comment on Abigail and Nabal, there's a map. If you get the map up. I don't know if you can zoom in, but that's like a map of Israel. I don't know if you have a bigger... I didn't get it's not a good map of the whole region, but on the Mediterranean, on the, east side of the Mediterranean, you have that lip of coast Israel. At the bottom of the picture, you go to the bottom of the picture, that's where Egypt is. You go to the right of the picture, you're going off into Jordan, Iraq, Iran, that region. You go north, you're going up into Lebanon, Syria, up into Turkey, if you keep going up. And so that's the area of Israel that we're talking about. And then you zoom right in there where it says Hebron. Go down, Hebron. That's roughly the region we're talking about. So the next map shows it a little bit better. So that's the area that David is looping around in, running away from Saul. So you've got some of these you might recognize from the last few weeks, the wilderness of Ziph, the Ziphites and that kind of thing. So David's looping around in that area there. And then you can see down the bottom there, Carmel and Maon. So that's and Gedi, you know, that was last week's chapter. And then you got Carmel and Maon at the bottom there. Yeah. Oh, excellent. That's great. And so that's where this scene is set. So there's a village. There's this rich guy. He's got a business, you know, locally. He goes and shears sheep, and he's super rich. Okay. And then we're going to be introduced to these characters, Nabal and Abigail. Now it's a kind of a love story, this chapter, you know. And when you read this chapter, you're going to, if you're a man with any dignity, you're going to fall in love with Abigail. That's what's going to happen as you read this chapter. She's a wonderful character. And then the opposite, and Father Tadros Malti says this, and he says, if you think Abigail's good, well, then you should fall in love with David too. You know, and they do fall in love together because of the way they respond to one another and the way that they do things in such an honorable way. We're not so much concerned with the beauty of her appearance. We're much more concerned with the beauty of her character. And so she is presented in such a lovely way, and they're really presented in such a really wonderful way, the way that David and Abigail carry on in this chapter. So we're going to reflect on them a little bit as we go through the chapter. Oh, there's another map there. I don't know why I did that. Oh, yeah. Okay. The third map is to put in context. So David, while he was there, he functioned as kind of a guard for the locals, you know. So him and his team of warriors, they functioned as a guard because they would regularly, in those days, you know, people are always looting and pillaging for resources. You know, that's how it worked. You have a village that has a bit of money, you go and loot and pillage that village in those days, take what you can, money, sheep, whatever, a couple of slaves, sell them off. And that's constantly happening in that era of the world, in that part of the world. So you had the Amalekites and the Moabites and all these people not far away. So these people were always targets. They were kind of soft targets unless they had a good army. So David was there, and it's a big relief to the people when David's there. He's protecting them and he's doing it in an honest way. So it is something good that he was doing for them. And so when he gets treated the way he gets treated, the context is that that's a real insult. It's really unthankful and it's really unreasonable to deal with David in that way. So next slide. So we're introduced to these characters, Nabal and Abigail, and we're introduced automatically that Abigail is introduced to us a woman of good understanding. And Bedi there says that her name means a father's joy. That's the meaning of her name. So she's introduced positively. Nabal is introduced as a fool, okay? A man who is harsh, evil, difficult to talk to. He is, and later on, a scoundrel. He's not a good guy. And so you see the difference, and we're going to see as we go through the chapter, the difference between someone who is godly and someone who is ungodly. Someone that is trying to please God and someone that couldn't care less about pleasing God. One ends up a fool. One ends up dying in a horrible circumstance. The other person ends up honored and glorified, and God looks after them. And so we're going to see the difference between... And when someone is ungodly, they end up foolish. They end up making bad decisions. When someone is godly, they end up making good decisions. And that's how it goes. So it's not about good decision-making, bad decision-making is not, and this chapter is trying to show that, is not about intellect. It is not about because I have experience in life and I just get it and I've asked the right people. It's all about being godly or ungodly. When someone is godly, they know how, they become wise. When someone is ungodly, they become fools for many reasons, and we'll go through a little bit of that through the chapter. So Bedi the Venerable says, Nabal means fool, and Abigail means father's joy. Foolish was anyone skilled in the law who had the key to knowledge but did not himself enter, and prevented from entering those who wanted to. So he's kind of commenting that this foolishness is like the Pharisees. But what he's trying to say is someone who is not godly ends a fool. That's bottom line. You have the capacity to be godly, but you choose not to be godly, you end up a fool. For in such circumstances, she, and then talking about her, she was very wise to understand the word of faith, and she was respectable to carry out what she understood. So she, in the opposite, was a woman of faith, and therefore became a woman of wisdom. And so it is the faith that creates the wisdom. It's the lack of faith or refusing to be godly that leads to foolishness. Okay, so we'll read verses 4 to 9. When David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name." So David's being honorable. He's going straight to the man of the house and says, "All right, well, we need some help here. We've been helping your people." Goes straight to the man of the house. And so he knows he's in Carmel. That's where he runs his business. So go to Carmel and speak to them. "And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity, 'Peace to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Now therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David.' So when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in the name of David and waited." So David, as I said, the context is that he was actually protecting these people. It was a huge relief to them that they would get the relief of this group of army to look after them when they can be attacked easily. So Father Tadros Malaty comments that actually David is, and he always is, you read any of the fathers, David becomes a type of Christ, that he is a wall of protection for us. That a relationship with Christ becomes a wall of protection from sin and enemies and the devil and things that function to destroy us. And we as well should follow that same pattern of living. As David had in his heart that I will help those in need, I will always be their support, I'll be their wall, I will look after those who struggle, I'll look after those who don't have support. We should follow that same model because that's the type of Christ, and David was the same. So that was David's way. Then we see Nabal, and what is a sign of foolishness is one, and we're going to see some of the things that he does which is so foolish, but one of the signs of someone who is ungodly and foolish is someone who is just unthankful. That you live your life not being thankful to those around you. When you're young, to your parents, to your siblings, to, if you're in workplace, to your co-workers, to your friends, to your partners, to your... Just living that kind of unthankfulness and not thankful to God. So always complaining, always negative, always whinging about my circumstances and ungrateful for what I have in front of me. This is a sign of foolishness because God gives, and God gives good things. And we shouldn't be negative all the time when we deal with and talk to God. Same with the people around us. If we are unthankful, it's a sign of foolishness, and people will it will be hard for people to deal with us. It's part of how he's such a scoundrel that he's just so unthankful. He doesn't see what David did for him as something good, or he expected it, or he was entitled to it. When we are not entitled, God gives us gifts, and we are not entitled, and it could be much less than that. But God does give, and so it's important that we are thankful. And the opposite of being unthankful is not something that is wise. It's a foolish thing to do. We'll read the next, and also just to contrast, see how gentle David is in his speech. Peace to you, peace to your house, peace. He's talking really gently and lovely and nice and not harsh. We compare that to Nabal now in verse 10. Then Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from?" So David's young men turned on their heels and went back, and they came and told him all these words. So another sign of foolishness is someone that is really harsh in their speech. So when you deal with people, it's not polite. It's a bit angry or harsh. I'm not gentle on the people around me. You lose relationships. Nabal here, just because of his harsh speaking, he lost this relationship. He kind of decided in this setting that, well, between Saul and David, who's going to be king? I'm going to put my money in with Saul. Even if he does do that, let's assume he does do that and he kind of considers Saul the top dog. If you do that, if he did that in this case, David wouldn't have had a problem with that, because actually David considered Saul the anointed of God. But he doesn't need to be harsh to David, but he chooses to speak like a fool. When we deal with other people, we don't need to speak like fools. We can be gentle under all circumstances. We don't have to allow ourselves to be, and what Father Thaddeus calls indecent. It's an indecent way of speaking. You shouldn't be talking like that to one another. It reminds me actually of if you ever travel to Japan. No one in Japan will ever talk to you in a harsh way. They're just such polite. It's part of the culture, Under all circumstances, they are polite to you. And it's a wonderful thing. Why does everyone want to travel to Japan? Because, well, the people are so polite. People always say that. Maybe behind the scenes, who knows what happens. But at least in public, people are always really, really, really polite. Even when they're uncompromising, but still they are polite. We should learn from that, and it's very important, because it doesn't kill relationships. It's a foolish thing to kill relationships. Later on, Nabal would need David, but he loses that opportunity. So it's silly for him to talk that way. It's foolishness. Also, his foolishness stems from greed. So he doesn't want to lose any of his resources. So he is wealthy. It's said it clearly. We know later he's going to throw a party like a king, they say. Right? So he's got a stack of resources. David is asking for a little bit. Okay? And he's asking for it legitimately, because it's in return for something I've done for you. And I'm in need. So even if he didn't do anything for him, there is a kind of like, there's a rule in the Old Testament, actually, it's given by God, that you are to be hospitable. If someone is in need, you say yes. And it's part of the law of the Old Testament. So for him to say no is against the law regardless. On top of that, David has helped. And he's done us a favor. Yeah, he refuses to give. And not just because he thinks Saul is the top dog, but actually it's because he's just stingy. He's just greedy. And so he's tight over his possessions, and therefore he refuses to give. So why should I give to you? I lose my meat, I lose my... and he's just... and so, a sign of foolishness is to hold on to your resources like that, as though those resources are yours. So we really be cautious of the way we hold on to the things that we perceive as ours. He perceives that these things are his, but he's talking to the king of Israel, who owns all the land, right? And this is a man sent to him by God, who owns all the land. Yet in Nabal's mind, he owns all his possessions, which he does not. And so greediness is like, and this is what St. John Chrysostom says, not giving to those in need is like stealing from the poor. And then he says it's like stealing from God himself. So be cautious, and it's a foolishness. It is one of the sure signs of foolishness that I don't give easily. I'm not generous. I hold on to what's mine. I'm stingy with my resources. That is a sure sign that someone is a fool, that someone is not godly. And Nabal turns out to be a fool, and one of the signs of his foolishness is this stinginess that he exhibits in this chapter. Okay, now we'll move on to verse 13. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Feel free to jump in anytime, guys. Yeah.
If you give too much, are you a fool as well?
If you give too much, are you a fool?
Yeah.
Well, we have an example up there, big picture at the back.
Yeah.
What do you think?
For him, no.
For him specifically? Only him?
What if you have a family?
Look, let us take the example of Saint Abraham. Saint Abraham, he was constantly belittled and attacked, and he didn't just have a family; he had a whole church to look after. And he would constantly give because that was the command to him, and he understood that I need to give. So God did not leave them, the church, destitute because he gave too much. So God will not leave your family destitute because you give too much. There is no risk of giving too much. It's not a human problem. There is only risk of holding on too much. God will always look after us. You know, that's the bottom line. That's the promise, and that's clear. You don't have to worry about what you're going to wear or what you're going to do. There's enough problems for you for today. So there is no such thing as giving too much. Our issue in humanity is giving too little. That's all it is. The distribution of wealth in human society, I said that, what they do is they every time a village or a city has some money, they're constantly under threat. That's why they had to build massive walls. If you ever travel to any of these ancient cities, massive walls, and they had to protect themselves because they were always under threat to be raped and pillaged. That was just constant, okay, across history. And the reason for that is because wealth was always unevenly distributed. There was always super wealthy and super poor. And that was just constant. And that caused so much disruption in society from beginning of time till now. And that's just how it is. And we would not have this problem if we gave the way God asked us to give. So no, I don't think you can give too much. I think it's very hard for us to give a lot. It's not easy. But it's not, and we'll never be destitute from giving to God. That will never happen. It hasn't happened in history and it won't happen. Okay, verse 13. Then David said to his men, every man gird on his sword. So every man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies. So David now gets cranky. Now let's compare this to the previous chapter. Okay, David is being chased by Saul. He's being riled up by his men, but he conquers his anger. That's what all the fathers kept saying. There was one thing we kept saying last week. He conquered his anger. In a battle, he just managed his rage and his anger. Now he succumbs to his anger. And this seems reasonable, but actually, as we read the rest of the chapter, we realize this would have been a big mistake for David. And so he's almost about to make a big mistake. He's going to wipe out this family, all the men from this family, because they won't give him, because he feels they've been hard done by. St. Augustine says, indeed, to the righteous David we might with reasonable justice say that he ought not to have become angry, not even with an ingrate who returned evil for good. Even if anger crept upon him, as it does upon a man, at least it ought not to have prevailed so far that he swore to do what he would either do in rage or not do and be forsworn. So he's saying that even if he was angry, you shouldn't act on your anger. So you shouldn't have been angry. You got to avoid anger under all circumstances in your life. Right? That's what he's saying. Under all circumstances, a sign of wisdom is to avoid anger. So now, by the way, in the next part of the chapter, we're going to think about wisdom as opposed to foolishness. But the next part of the chapter, one of the things that we need to avoid to be wise is avoid anger. Anger is always a foolish thing to do. Calmness, dealing with things in the proper way, is always the wise thing to do. Even if you do get angry, don't act on your anger. You don't ever act on your anger. And so that's what St. Augustine is saying there. Because there will always be a consequence to your anger. Anger never passes without consequences if you act on it. Unfortunately, and sometimes they're irreversible, even if it's a moment. Even if it's just one rare moment that you lost your temper in the wrong way, then there's a consequence to it, and sometimes you can't reverse that consequence. So we do the best we can never to be angry and never to act on our anger, because people do wear these consequences, sadly, and they're very hard to reverse. So Father Tadros Malaty says, David, who was known for his self-control and humility, now in some moments of weakness was about to commit a crime that would have grieved his heart all the rest of his life and would have been an offense to his people when the time comes for him to reign. So he's saying that if he acted on it in this moment, it would have been a consequence that was irreversible to him. He would have dealt with it internally for the rest of his life. So be cautious of your own anger. Don't let your anger take a hold of you. And consider it a foolish thing to be angry. Consider it a wise thing to always have control over your anger. And related is be wary of your actions. So any action you take, the reason why you have to avoid, and there's always consequences to acting in anger, is because you're almost always wrong when you'll never make a good decision when you're angry. It doesn't happen. I remember, I'll tease one of my nephews, on the soccer field. He believes that I play better when I'm angry. I play better. That's his assessment of soccer. You know, when I'm angry, I'm riled up. I'm a superstar. And I was trying to explain to him that actually no. You might have a little bit more energy, so you're a bit faster. You might hit the ball a bit harder, but you make bad decisions. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You've taken over someone else's position. You've made your team crazy. You know, the other team hates you now because everyone's screaming and it's all a big mess. In your mind, you see this as you played better because everything just got lit up. But actually, it was all detriment. There was nothing positive came out of it. And from the sideline, it's obvious, but on the field, no, it's clear to him. Anger is what won us the game. And you know that's the reality of everyone who's angry in any situation. It's a self-justified reality, but actually anything you do in that time is blind. Blind to the consequences, blind to what it's creating, blind to the way it's perceived by others, blind to the outcomes. Your decisions are almost always wrong when you're angry. That's why you don't act when you're angry. You're like a horse like that, you know, when you're angry. And so you have to be very cautious. St. Gregory the Great says, for when they are aroused, they do not perceive what is being said to them. So it's like you're blocking your ears when you're angry. But when they have been restored to their senses, they more willingly accept words of counsel, as they blush for having been peacefully borne with. For to the mind that is intoxicated with frenzy, everything said that is right appears to be wrong. So when you are angry, everything that's told to you that is correct, for you it seems wrong. So you become a fool. That's what he's saying. You, instead of being wise, just become incredibly foolish. When you're calm, opposite, you become wise. And so we be cautious of anger because it makes us fools. All right, now we'll read a bit of a lengthy passage as we get introduced to the wonderful Abigail. Now, one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them when we were in the fields. They were a wall to us both by night and day, all the time we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore, know and consider what you will do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And she said to her, so see how rich they are, how much they can put together. She just whipped it up, just like that. And she said to her servants, go on before me, see, I am coming after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. So it was, as she rode on the donkey, that she went down under cover of the hill, and there were David and his men coming down toward her. And she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him, and he has repaid me evil for good. May God do so and more also to the enemies of David, if I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning light. Now when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey and fell on her face before David and bowed down to the ground. So she fell at his feet and said, Oh, on me, my lord, on me let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservant speak in your ears and hear the words of your maidservant. Please let not my lord regard this scoundrel Nabal. For as his name is, so he is Nabal. I think it means foolish. Is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek harm for my Lord be as Nabal. And now this present which your maidservant has brought to my Lord, let it be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout your days. Yet a man has risen to pursue you and seek your life, but the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord has done for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you ruler over Israel, that this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. Long, nice, beautiful speech. You know, so there's so many lovely things in what she says, and we'll just contemplate a few of them. The first is that wisdom inside a person, so when someone is godly and God is with them, and then they think clearly the way that God guides them, and therefore they exhibit wisdom like she is exhibiting, it far outweighs physical beauty. Okay? Wisdom will shine through physical beauty. Okay? But physical beauty will not shine through foolishness. It's not the other way around. If someone is a fool, no matter what they appear, they will appear as a fool. And it will be a burden to the people dealing with them. But the opposite is not true. So that's why we don't focus on the physical appearance. Yes, she's considered beautiful in this scene, but actually what the Bible is trying to tell us is that why she's considered beautiful is because her character and her wisdom and her godliness is beautiful to behold. When she speaks there, when you read it and you take your time to read it, and I encourage you to do it in your own time again, you see how wonderful what she is saying is. Far more than someone that looks nice. And of course, we see it all the time in relationships. People being attractive doesn't stop relationships breaking down. That has no bearing on whether a relationship continues or not. Being wise, you never see, if there's a couple where there's a wise woman and a wise man and a godly woman, that they have trouble with each other. But someone who is foolish always gives trouble to the other people that they're dealing with. And that happens in relationships, and that happens in friendships, and that happens in everything. And so your wisdom will shine through physical attributes. Your physical attributes will not dumb down what a fool looks like. Okay? It's hard on the eyes, it's hard on the heart, it's hard on the ears, it's hard on everything when someone behaves as a fool, like Nabal. But it's very easy on the eyes, on the heart, on the mind, on the heart, when someone behaves as in wisdom. So Father Tadros Malti says, she was filled with wisdom that reflected on her features to make her of beautiful appearance. And my experience, by the way, is that people tend to find people attractive that are happy, joyful, pleasant to deal with, not angry all the time. So someone who is attractive but is angry, who is frowning, who is sad, who is conflicting, becomes very unattractive to the people dealing with them. Okay? So what he's saying is that it's reflected on the appearance. Someone of a pleasant demeanor, someone of a wise demeanor is reflected on the appearance. There are many good-looking women, yet without wisdom, they lose the value of their beauty that can transformed into destruction of their personality and life. This is not only for women, this is for men as well. When we focus on our external appearance, the way we look, it can be to our detriment. And actually, if the inner man, the inside, is not wise, that external value has no value. The external appearance has no value. It just becomes diminished into nothing. So be cautious of focusing on that. Focus all your attention on the godliness and the inner person that shines out. It's far more important for you. Also, wisdom is something that is recognized by all. You know, so when someone is wise, it's not just in their appearance, it's in their dealings. And people like to deal with someone who is godly and wise. People hate to deal with someone who is foolish and ungodly. So you have in this scene, the young men, they see what's going to happen with Nabal. They know that he's a mess. They know that he's causing a problem for the family. So they run quickly to Abigail. They know automatically the person you go to is Abigail. David, we can say it wasn't a mistake. He didn't know. He's just being honorable to go to the man of the house. But he went to the fool of the house. Whereas everyone else in the house knows you go straight to Abigail because Abigail has a wisdom. She is calm. She will listen to what you have to say. Nabal is unapproachable. So she listens, and everyone recognizes that about her. So therefore they go to her and they seek her counsel and they seek her guidance, and she immediately takes action, of course. So naturally, people will run to the wise and they'll run away from the fool. The unapproachable fool you'll just avoid because they don't listen. I talk, but they're not hearing. They're only focused on themselves. So you kind of don't want to waste your time. Whereas someone that's listening, hearing what I'm saying, then I'll seek their guidance and their wisdom. And that's reflected in her listening. So because Nabal doesn't, the servant says it very specifically. One cannot speak to Nabal. How many times you might have dealt with people like this in your workplaces or whatever. There's just no talking to them. It's like I'm talking to myself. We're on a different planet. I'm trying to explain a concept, but they're talking in another direction completely. And you say, I'm wasting my time here. Whereas, because they're not listening, that's a product of not listening. It's not the intellect that's the problem. They're not listening. Whereas Abigail listens, And of course, a sign of you to be wise is to listen. Open your ears. Hear. I was saying, we were talking about Moses at the servants' camp, and we were saying that one of his strengths was the fact that he couldn't speak properly, and he knew he couldn't speak properly. So he had to be quiet. Therefore, he had to listen. And when he listened, he heard the voice of God, and God talked through him. So you got to listen to hear God. You got to listen to hear what people are saying, to hear the concerns of the people around you, especially people that are close to you in a relationship. It's a sign of wisdom to open your ears, to talk less and to listen more. And then she's so clever in the way that she seeks reconciliation. Is she has this really clever method. Okay. So, and it's surprising. Often when we're in conflict, we don't know how to resolve the conflict. But here she is, clear as day, showing us how to resolve conflict. Number one is correct the wrong, right? So the wrong has been done. They should have given David some resources. What does she do? 200 cakes of figs, clusters of raisins, whatever. She collects it all and says, here, the thing that should have been done, it's being done. So that's number one. Correct the wrong. If you're able to, correct the wrong. Apologize if that's all you can do. But if it's actual wrong that needs to be done, just correct it. Okay. The second thing is bring gifts. It's such a simple solution, but it works. It's wonderfully powerful. They say that's one of the 4 love languages, don't they? One of them is gift giving, right? It works, right? It might not work for everyone, and maybe everyone doesn't care as much, but it is something that works, and it's clever, and it doesn't have to be expensive or valuable, but it's the idea of when I want to reconcile, and it's a sign of wisdom that someone is in conflict, and I don't want them to be in conflict with me, even if it's not my fault, even if it's their fault, I don't want conflict. So she comes and brings a gift. It's not her problem. She didn't do this, right? And notice as well, I've written it there, that she apologizes even though it's not her error. Let it be on me. It's not my mistake. We refuse to apologize if we're not at fault. Or if we feel like we're not at fault. And by the way, 99% of the time when you feel like you're not at fault, you actually are at fault. And therefore you should apologize anyway. So automatic default, just apologize. Trust me. Right? That's in all relationships, guys. So because you had some part to play in the conflict. There's no two people at conflict and you had no part to play in it. So she apologizes and says, let it be on me. Let it be on me. Okay? And so she's very clever. And then she comes in humility, not in arrogance, not in conflict. Not, you shouldn't be behaving this way, David. She comes in humility. She bows in front of him. She says, "You're my Lord, and I'm sorry. And yes, you did all these wonderful things for us, but please don't behave this way towards us." So very wise in dealing, and it's just a clever way of dealing with conflict. Also, she is very clever in the language that she chooses, that she reminds David of the promises of God. So David has been promised to be king. So she's saying to him, you are going to be the king. You don't need to behave this way. You don't need to drop to his level. Nabal is a scoundrel. You don't need to be a scoundrel. You don't need to drop. You keep your level up. So she reminds him that God's going to defend you as he always has. God is going to look after you as he always has. God has made you king, so that's not going to change. And she reminds him as well that there's consequences to this. Later on, you're going to be king, and this is all going to be remembered. Don't let that happen to you. So she's so wise in bringing God into the equation. That's not to throw God in his face, but it's just to remind him that God is present, God is watching, and God is looking after you. God has blessed you, so why are you taking a pathway as if this Nabal can have any impact on what God has promised you? You know, she's so clever in that way, because that's the truth. You know, sometimes we get so cranky, as if what's happened to us or what's bothering us has any impact on the plan of God for my life, when it cannot. The only thing that can impact the plan of God in my life is my own self. The only thing that can get in David's way now is David. Simple as that. He loses his temper, well then he can start spiraling away from God. So she's reminding him of that, saying, no, don't ruin what God has given you by losing your temper in this way. It's too important that you remain loyal to God, because God has always been loyal to you. So she's so wise in expressing that reality. And of course, David is super wise in hearing that reality. So as she listened, David listens. He's angry, but he still listens. So that's one way of thinking about reconciliation, and also kind of deterring people off a negative course. You know, trying to remind them of God's presence in their life, and that God doesn't forego his promises to you. Okay, we'll read verses 32 to 34. Any questions so far? Then David said to Abigail, "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed, and from avenging myself with my own hand. For indeed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has kept me back from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely by morning light no males would have been left to Nabal." David, again, as I said, and Father Taras he says this about them, is as wonderful as Abigail is, David is just as wonderful, right? That he stops in his course, he doesn't let anger take the day, and he's approachable, you know. He's angry, but he's allowing himself to be approached. He's not so angry that he will not listen, you know. He hasn't set his course. He's made a vow, I'm going to go kill these people, but he allows himself to be reoriented. So he allows himself to hear the right direction and follow it. Stubbornness will destroy you, you know. To be stubborn will always destroy us. So if we insist on our path, no matter how everyone is telling me, don't go down this path. And when I say everyone, I mean like my parents, the people around, the close friends that I trust, my priest, they're telling me, don't go down this path. And I'm not allowing the right voice to push me away from that path. Then that stubbornness will destroy you. But if I allow myself to listen and then to be redirected in the direction of God, then I will not be destroyed. So David had the chance to destroy himself, but luckily he turns the right way. And the opposite, Nabal, who should have listened but didn't, you know. So they said about him, for he's such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him. So he relied on his own way of thinking. And so the way that Father Tadros Malati and this Father Dorotheus puts it is that it's foolish to rely on your own counsel and not to listen to the counsel of others. So as long as you rely on your own counsel, it's a fool's errand. It is impossible for someone who holds fast to his personal judgment and thought to deny himself. You cannot deny yourself and therefore follow God unless you follow the counsel of others. If you insist on your own thinking always, then father-daughter affair, there is nothing more regretful nor more dangerous than for man to be his own counselor. So be cautious, to be stubborn, and to think your own way and to not listen to the counsel of others. It's a sign of foolishness. No wise person in history has ever functioned that way. Also, it's important not to make vows without spiritual guidance. Again, that's a fool's errand. To make some sort of big vow, sometimes we get so emotional about something and we make a big vow to God. I'm going to do this. I'm going to give up all my money. And you have the capacity and you don't have the spiritual energy to do it. And you have a family, as Chris said, and I'm going to make this big vow. I'm going to do something that I can't achieve. Or I can achieve it, but it's going to damage me. So you don't make vows or oaths without spiritual counsel. Always with spiritual counsel. And if you make an oath that is wrong, or you're worried it's wrong, go get spiritual guidance to release you from that oath, because that will be a mistake to carry out that oath. It always reminds us of Jephthah. Everyone knows the story of Jephthah. Does anyone remember? In the book of Judges? Can anyone tell me the story of Jephthah? He made a vow and he carried it out, and it was ridiculous. Yeah, he said, the first thing comes out of my door when I come back from battle, I'm going to sacrifice it to God. Right? He expected not animals to come out of his house, because animals don't come out of people's houses. He expected like a slave or something. His daughter comes out, and what does he do? He carries out his vow and he kills his daughter. Right? The Bible doesn't tell us that story to condone it. The Bible tells us a story to show us the foolishness of making a vow without spiritual counsel. And then, if you make a vow that's wrong, you shouldn't carry it out. And so I actually got a few quotes, or maybe just one. Yeah, I got a couple of quotes from the fathers to justify this. So Bede the Venerable, he says, if it should perhaps happen that we swear carelessly to something which, if carried out, would have most unfortunate consequences, we should know that we should willingly change it in accord with more salutary counsel. There is an urgent necessity for us to break our oath rather than to turn to another more serious crime in order to avoid breaking our oath. So you don't carry it through. Some people, I'm never going to forgive this person. I'm never going to reconcile this person. I'm never going to, you make a vow like that. You have to be cautious to carry it out. And St. John Cassian says, even God relented from his action. So God would vow to destroy a people or a person, and then, because they bowed down in front of him and they humbled himself in front of him, even God would change his course of action. So if God can do that, then we can. That's what St. John Cassian says. Further, we are taught at considerable length by other texts of Scripture, too, that we neither should nor can fulfill everything that we decide upon, whether with tranquil or upset mind. So whether you do it in calmness or you do it when you're emotionally heightened, you don't fulfill everything that you've had a thought to do, because you can make mistakes. In them we frequently read that holy men or angels or even Almighty God himself altered the things that they had promised. So the point is that it's not to not make vow. Okay, it's good to make a covenant between me and God and contracts between me and God, and because God deals with us in a contractual or covenantal relationship. But we don't make them rashly in emotionally heightened states, and we don't do it without spiritual counsel. Okay, that's the important principle. You always get spiritual counsel, or you're going to make mistakes. So again, that's a foolish thing to do. A wise thing to do is get spiritual counsel. Before you do anything, get spiritual counsel. Don't just go and jump into things that are wrong. All right, we'll read the last part of the chapter, and then we'll call it. So David received from her hand what she had brought him, and said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have heeded your voice and respected your person. Now Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was, holding a feast. So I said to you, he's super rich, and he's a fool. Now Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was, holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. Therefore she told him nothing, little or much, until morning light. You see, the story is very well designed to make him really look like a fool. He's about to get him and his whole family killed, and he's sitting there having a feast and getting drunk in his house and has no awareness of what's going on outside. Even his wife has saved him. In those days, for the woman to save the man, it's like a dishonor to the man that he's the one that's acting this way, and he's the weakling, and the wife is the one that's got the courage and the strength. And he's just a fool in this scenario, you know. The foolishness, they're trying to show us that there's certain behaviors that become really, really foolish, which we've showed some of them, but we'll see some others now. So it was in the morning, when the wine had gone from Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and he became like a stone. Then it happened after about 10 days that the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept his servant from evil. For the Lord has returned the wickedness of Nabal on his own head." And David sent and proposed to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David had come to Abigail at Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, "David sent us to you to ask you to become his wife." Then she arose, bowed her face to the earth, and said, "Here is your maidservant, a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." So Abigail rose in haste and rode on a donkey, attended by 5 of her maidens, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and so both of them were his wives. But Saul had given Michal, his daughter. So Michal was promised to David by Saul, but he reneged. But Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galim. And so we go back to David, who, now that he relented, you know, as we said, and he didn't act on his anger through the wisdom of Abigail, we now see why you shouldn't act in your anger. Okay, one, you make mistakes, we said before. You're going to see red and you're not going to see the right thing. Everything seems, you become a fool and you see everything in the wrong way. But also, because God will always look after you. So leave it to God. In the end, Nabal gets struck down by the hand of God. It's a much better way for Nabal to be struck down than by the hand of David. The hand of God is more powerful, it's more just, it's more wise, and will do it in the right way. Yeah. Nabal? He didn't have to get killed. He was. So I think that the way the story is designed is to show us that, one, he died of foolishness. He died of that he's honored by God. God struck him down. The man was a fool. And God's going to look after the people of God, David and Abigail. And his time was up. Also, it's also important for him to understand, or for us to understand, that you live a fool's life. You decide to be drunk. So one of the signs of foolishness is this idea of being drunk, getting drunk. It makes us fools. That's what the story is trying to say. Getting drunk makes you a fool. You don't have your rational reasoning. The guy's in a serious situation. He's not aware of it, right? And so he goes and gets drunk. It makes him a fool. And so when he becomes a fool in that way, it's like your soul can be called off you at any given moment. And you don't want to be called when you're acting like a fool. That's the idea. And so one of the warnings from the text is to say, be careful. You want to, like the 5 foolish virgins, you get caught out. This man got caught out, and it obviously was his habit to get drunk. It was his habit to throw these kind of parties. It was his habit to behave silly. So he got caught within his habit. That's all it was. It's not a one-off moment. And mind you, if he decides to be a fool, even in a moment, we said it before with anger, you can suffer the consequences of that. You can be called in that moment. But certainly, if you're going to have a repeated amoral behavior, you're going to get called to account in that. And that's something to be afraid of. You think about partners that are unfaithful, that they go on for a long time and they get caught out within that. And imagine my life is called in a state of unfaithfulness. And so we have to be cautious. So he didn't have to die, but he did die. And he died in this amoral state. So this moral decay that he lived in and moral lowness that he lived in was a sign of his foolishness. And he got called to account at that time. It can happen. And it does happen. How many people die because of drunken accidents or drunken whatever. So it's not that uncommon in society. And so it's kind of a word of warning. Be careful. And also, as we said, David would have acted wrong. Now, God did the outcome that David wanted anyway, except he did it perfectly. And the whole household didn't have to die, only Nabal had to die. And so God does it. The hand of God is the proper hand, not my hand. So you don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to act in anger. And even if you're wrong, so in your anger and you're wrong and you would have acted wrong, well, if you don't act on it, let God act, then you were saved from your own wrong assessment. If you were right, God will vindicate you. So it's either your anger was justified and God will vindicate it, or your anger was unjustified and therefore you're protected from your own anger. Either way, don't act on your anger. That's the point. So Sylvian, the presbyter, when the holy David was had borne the affronts and insults of Nabal from Carmel, because David delayed vengeance, he was avenged at once by the very hand of God. So he's saying that God will intervene. Okay, and we were already talking about this next slide, but the immoral life, it leads to foolishness. It's a sign of foolishness, and Nabal was wasting his resources on nonsense when he could have given a little bit of his resources to David and saved all of this and held his head up high. But he ignored those in need. He ignored his wife and family. Think about it. He's having this big party. Where's Abigail? He doesn't even know Abigail's not even there. You know, she comes in the next morning and says, "Oh, you know what happened last night?" He's got no idea. You know, so he's throwing King's party where his wife isn't even present. So you can only imagine the level of immoral life he was living. You know, there's probably all sorts of other things he was doing within that context that was destroying him, was making him a fool. You know, so the immoral life is a foolish life. That's the point. You know, we should be cautious to live the moral life properly, because the alternative is a foolish life. And then Abigail accepts David's invitation to be his wife. Father Tados Malti comments, actually, David at this point is still destitute. He's a rogue. He's being chased by the king. He has no possessions. And she chooses him in his affliction. And therefore, she gets the glory when he becomes glorified, you know. And so David is not yet glorified. And it reminds us of the idea of the cross. The idea of the cross, to follow God, which is the wise pathway of the cross, which is wisdom, is that you carry the cross with its affliction, what comes with it, but you also get the glory of that, you know. So you don't just follow God when things are good and we abandon God when we struggle. We follow God in all circumstances so we can be glorified with God. And it always ends in glory. You know, David, as I said, is a type of Christ. So her marrying him is like attaching herself to Christ. And us, we behave like Abigail. We attach ourselves to God by carrying the cross, and therefore we get the glory. And so the pathway to glory is the cross. That's the idea. And so Father Tados Malti says, she accepted him as her husband in his time of affliction to accompany him in that of glory. So she got both. And that's how it goes with God. You walk with God in all circumstances, God will glorify us, and we'll get the glory of walking with God. I think that's it. Glory be to God forever and ever. Amen. Go for it.
I was just gonna say, like, when Abigail was like, she first went to David, when she was giving the gifts and all that, like, obviously she was being a type of Christ in that moment, because not only was she doing that, was she rectifying everything, and she was trying to take it on herself, like Christ did for us, but she was also interceding for Nabal. It's like, obviously we know, like, Nabal didn't deserve it, like, and he had this life, but Christ was like, for us maybe it would be the same thing. So like, Christ literally chose in his last moments to pray for us, ask for our forgiveness, and he gave the gift of himself. So, and he also, basically, he gave his body and blood for us. And like, obviously, in that case, Abigail was willing to take it all on herself. Like, everything that Nabal did, she was about asking for mercy. And again, like, Christ didn't see himself as above. He was fully in humanity, even though he was God, and he could have done anything he wanted. He still chose the cross, and obviously that's why they call it one of the most glorious moments, and why it's so important to us, because the fact that the love that he had. So again, I think it just like shows that God will send people into our lives, even if we feel in a certain way, like maybe we're not acting in the right way, but sometimes even then, like, they would be able to show Christ through them to us, to be able to get us on the right track. And obviously it's important, like even when we're praying, to ask the saints as well to intercede for us, because obviously they've lived a normal life. They've lived a life similar to us, but the difference is they like chose Christ, and they could pray for us in our stead. So they could say, they can ask God, oh, like take this sinner, and like ask for mercy.
Yeah, it's a beautiful contemplation.
Yeah.
And for Abigail, you're right, Abigail is very much a type of Christ in that sense, that she carried the sin of the family, she presented gifts, she restored, she rectified everything. It's really wonderful contemplation. Any other comments or questions, guys? Thanks for... Do you want to actually ask something?
Yeah, it sounds yeah. So David ended up marrying Abigail, right?
Yeah.
So so is are you allowed to divorce a fool?
No. No. David's a
there
unique
exceptions?
case. He was entitled to marry multiple women. Actually, the rule from the beginning was always one. But the Jewish people started to lose sight of that and start to betray that rule. But it was restored later on, so no.
Why wasn't David condemned for that as a fool as well? For marrying,
For multiple marriages.
yeah.
Look, at that time, it was kind of like a custom. They just kind of fell into that pattern and they did it. And it was something that just became acceptable, even though it wasn't from the beginning. Also, in those days as well, I mean, when the king married and they had multiple wives, like, for example, Solomon, he had many, many wives. He was actually, in those days, he was looking after them. So a lot of these people, when he had lots of wives, they had access to the wealth of the king, you know, and so they could be looked after as a family. And so he's not neglecting them or not caring about them. So it was actually maybe a way of looking after those people at that time. Sometimes they would marry women that actually they didn't have physical relationship with or anything like that. They were just looking after them, caring for them. So perhaps that's one way of thinking about it. But why they didn't get condemned, and it was acceptable in those days. But generally speaking, it was meant to be just the one.
And it was almost like that was okay if he did that because this guy deserved it. But then we're saying, or the message of today is that you should not be angry, you should not be quick for anger and all of that. But then it seems like his one was okay, that he was angry.
No, I think that's the point. It wasn't okay, and he would have suffered for it.
If he had actually gone ahead.
Yeah, So he shouldn't have been angry, and he shouldn't act on his anger, and so it was not okay. And that's why Abigail diverted his attention. That's the idea. So at times, there's the zeal of the Lord is put on these people to protect Israel and to protect the story of salvation. This did not protect the story of salvation. It had nothing to do with the story of salvation. David is headed towards the king of Israel, and through that line is going to lead to Christ. But this would have been an error. So I think it wasn't justified and it wasn't okay. And the fathers say, no, he shouldn't have gotten angry. And that's clear from the context of the story where Abigail re-diverts him, saying, you're going to regret it. It shouldn't be this way. So just... And he says, you're right, I would have made a mistake. He says it himself. This would have been a mistake. You know, it would have been blood on my hands. Because they didn't need all to die just because I'm angry with Nabal. You know, but he was going to kill them all. You know. Thank you for listening, guys. Glory be to God.